The drums that thundered through the mountain settlement that morning carried more than just rhythm. They carried the weight of judgment, the finality of exile, and the shattering of a young woman's world. Lyra Moonwhisper, daughter of the High Priestess and heir to one of the most sacred bloodlines in the Silver Star tribe, stood in the center of the ceremonial circle as the Council of Elders prepared to pronounce the sentence that would strip her of everything she had ever known. At 19, she possessed a beauty that had inspired poets, and a spirit that had challenged the very foundations of their ancient society. But it was her heart, wild, passionate, and utterly uncompromising in its devotion to forbidden love, that had brought her to this moment of ultimate disgrace. If you love these stories and don't want to miss any, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The Silver Star tribe had governed the sacred mountain territories for more than 8 centuries, their society built upon a complex system of bloodline hierarchies, spiritual traditions, and marriage laws that were considered as immutable as the mountains themselves. Every aspect of tribal life was regulated by customs that had been passed down through countless generations, creating a social structure so rigid that deviation from its rules was seen not just as rebellion, but as sacrilege against the ancestral spirits who watched over their people. The tribe's territory encompassed 3 major mountain peaks and the valleys between them, an area rich in natural resources and spiritual energy that had attracted human settlement since time immemorial. Ancient standing stones marked sacred sites throughout the region, each one connected to specific rituals and ceremonies that maintained the delicate balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. The Silver Stars saw themselves as guardians of these sacred places, protectors of mysteries that had been entrusted to their bloodline by beings whose names were too holy to speak aloud. Their capital settlement, Lunaris, was built into the side of the highest mountain and consisted of terraced levels that rose toward the summit like a great stone pyramid. The lower levels housed the common people, farmers, craftspeople, and merchants who provided the material foundation for their civilization. The middle levels contained the homes of the warrior class and minor nobility, people whose bloodlines carried some spiritual authority, but who lacked the pure genetic heritage necessary for true religious leadership. The upper levels were reserved for the priesthood and their families, including the magnificent temple complex that crowned the entire structure and served as the spiritual heart of their world. At the very top of this hierarchy stood the High Priestess, currently Serena Moonwhisper, whose bloodline could be traced back unbroken to the legendary founder of their tribe. The High Priestess was not just a religious leader, but the ultimate authority on all matters affecting tribal welfare, from military strategy to trade negotiations to the complex marriage arrangements that preserved the purity of their spiritual bloodlines. Marriage, in particular, was considered too important to be left to the whims of individual choice. The Silver Star genetic heritage carried specific spiritual abilities that were passed down through bloodline connections, and these gifts were strongest when both parents possessed compatible magical aptitudes. Young people were betrothed according to careful calculations that took into account not just bloodline compatibility but also spiritual power levels, astrological alignments, economic advantages, and political alliances that could strengthen the tribe's position relative to their neighbors. Love was considered a pleasant but ultimately irrelevant factor in these arrangements, something that might develop over time between well-matched partners, but should never be allowed to override the greater good of tribal stability and spiritual advancement. The concept of marrying for love was seen as a dangerous selfishness that could corrupt the bloodlines and weaken the magical heritage that protected their people from the many threats that existed in their dangerous world. Lyra had been promised in marriage to Aldrich Stormcrown since her 12th birthday, a union that would unite 2 of the most powerful families in the tribe and potentially produce children with extraordinary spiritual abilities. The betrothal had been celebrated throughout the settlement as a guarantee that the next generation of leadership would possess unprecedented magical gifts and political authority. Aldrich was everything that tribal law required in a husband for someone of Lyra's elevated status, wealthy from his family's control of the silver mines that gave their tribe its name, well-connected through extensive kinship networks that reached into every level of their society, spiritually gifted with abilities that complemented Lyra's own powers, and absolutely devoted to maintaining the traditional ways that had preserved their people through centuries of challenges and changes. He was also intelligent, well-educated in both practical and mystical arts, physically attractive in the classical sense that their culture valued, and genuinely committed to being a good husband and father according to the standards of their society. By any objective measure, he was an ideal match for the High Priestess's daughter and heir. The problem was that he was completely incapable of understanding the fire that burned in Lyra's heart, the passionate intensity that made her question every assumption about duty, tradition, and the role of individual choice in shaping one's destiny. Aldrich approached life with the methodical rationality of someone who had never experienced doubt about the wisdom of their culture's fundamental principles, while Lyra burned with questions that challenged the very foundations of everything they had been taught to believe. Their few supervised meetings during the years leading up to their planned wedding had revealed the fundamental incompatibility of their natures, despite their superficial suitability as breeding partners for the next generation of magical aristocracy. Aldrich spoke of duty, tradition, and the importance of preserving their bloodline's spiritual authority. Lyra spoke of dreams, possibilities, and the need to evolve beyond the limitations imposed by ancient customs that might no longer serve their people's best interests. "You think too much," Aldrich had told her during one of their formal courtship meetings, his tone carrying the gentle condescension of someone explaining obvious truths to a confused child. A woman's role is to support her husband's decisions and bear children who will carry forward his bloodline. Questioning the wisdom of our ancestors is both unnecessary and dangerous. "But what if our ancestors were wrong about some things?" Lyra had replied, her voice carrying the dangerous intensity that marked her as someone who could never be satisfied with easy answers. "What if blind obedience to tradition is preventing us from discovering better ways of living and organizing our society?" The conversation had ended uncomfortably, with both young people understanding that their fundamental worldviews were incompatible, despite their families' expectations for their future together. Aldrich had reported to the High Priestess that her daughter seemed to be going through a phase of youthful rebellion that would hopefully resolve itself as she matured and accepted her responsibilities. Lyra had confided to her closest friends that she felt like she was being prepared for sacrifice to preserve a system that she wasn't sure deserved to be preserved. The crisis that would eventually lead to her exile began during Lyra's 17th year, when she first encountered Darius Shadowheart during the annual harvest festival that brought together multiple tribes for trade and celebration. The festival was one of the few times when the rigid social boundaries that normally governed tribal interactions were temporarily relaxed, allowing people from different communities and social ranks to mingle in ways that would be impossible during ordinary circumstances. Darius belonged to the Moonraven clan, a group that was technically allied with the Silver Stars, but was considered inferior in terms of spiritual power and social status. The Moonravens controlled territories to the east that were rich in certain herbs and minerals needed for magical practices, making them valuable trading partners despite their lower position in the regional hierarchy. Their spiritual traditions were older and more primitive than those of the Silver Stars, based on direct communion with natural forces rather than the sophisticated ritual magic that marked advanced civilization. More problematically, from the Silver Star perspective, Darius was what tribal law classified as spirit-touched, someone who had been blessed with supernatural abilities, but whose powers came from sources that were not officially recognized by the established religious hierarchy. The spirit-touched were individuals who had received their gifts through direct contact with otherworldly entities, rather than through the careful bloodline preservation that produced predictable and controllable magical abilities. These wild talents were both more powerful and more unpredictable than hereditary magic, making their possessors valuable but dangerous allies. Spirit-touched individuals could accomplish things that were impossible for even the most skilled traditional practitioners, but their abilities came with costs and complications that made the established priesthood nervous about their influence on spiritual doctrine and social stability. The spirit-touched were not exactly outcasts in regional society, but they occupied an uncomfortable position that reflected the tension between practical utility and theological orthodoxy. Their abilities were too useful to be completely rejected. They could heal diseases that baffled conventional medicine, communicate with natural forces that ignored traditional rituals, and access information from spiritual realms that were normally beyond human reach. But their unconventional methods and unpredictable results made the traditional priesthood nervous about legitimizing their practices or allowing them to compete with established religious authority. As a result, the spirit-touched were tolerated as long as they remained in subordinate roles, providing services that complemented rather than challenged the work of the official priesthood. They were never allowed to advance to positions of real authority within the established religious hierarchy, never permitted to marry into the highest-ranking bloodlines, and never given the kind of social recognition that would suggest their methods were equally valid alternatives to traditional practices, which made Lyra's immediate and overwhelming attraction to Darius not just personally inconvenient, but socially catastrophic in ways that neither of them initially understood. Their first meeting had occurred during the traditional blessing ceremony that opened each year's festival, when representatives from all the participating tribes gathered in the Great Circle to invoke the protection of the ancestral spirits and request favorable conditions for the trading and cultural exchanges that would follow. The ceremony was one of the most important events in the regional calendar, requiring precise coordination between multiple priesthoods and careful attention to protocols that had been established over centuries of intertribal cooperation. Lyra had been serving as an acolyte to her mother, the High Priestess Serena, helping to maintain the sacred fires and prepare the ritual offerings that would ensure the festival's spiritual success. Her role was both ceremonial and practical. As the High Priestess's daughter and heir, she needed to be seen participating in the most important religious observances, but she also possessed genuine abilities that were necessary for the complex magical workings involved in such large-scale spiritual events. The ceremony required representatives from each participating tribe to contribute specific elements to a collective ritual that would weave together their various spiritual traditions into a unified blessing. The Silver Stars provided the ceremonial framework and overall coordination, while the other tribes contributed specialized knowledge and materials that reflected their unique magical specialties and cultural perspectives. Darius had been present as part of a Moonraven delegation seeking healing services for members of his tribe who had been afflicted by a mysterious illness that their own medicine workers could not cure. His official role was supposedly limited to translation and negotiation, serving as an intermediary between the Moonraven leaders and the Silver Star healers, who might be able to provide the sophisticated medical magic necessary to address their crisis. But Lyra had noticed immediately that he was the one who actually understood the spiritual dimensions of the problem that had brought his people to the festival. While the official Moonraven representatives spoke in general terms about symptoms and failed treatments, Darius was quietly providing the kind of detailed information about energy patterns and spiritual disruptions that revealed deep understanding of the mystical forces involved in the illness. His insights were delivered with a casualness that suggested he took his unusual abilities for granted, but Lyra could see that his perception of spiritual realities was far more sophisticated than anything demonstrated by the official Moonraven priesthood. He was describing energy patterns that would be difficult for even experienced Silver Star practitioners to detect, and suggesting treatment approaches that showed familiarity with advanced magical theory that was supposed to be beyond the educational level of someone from his cultural background. When their eyes met across the ceremonial circle during the complex invocation that formed the centerpiece of the opening ceremony, Lyra had felt something that she later described as being struck by lightning made of starlight. The connection was immediate, profound, and absolutely undeniable, creating an awareness of each other that transcended normal human interaction and entered the realm of spiritual communion. The sensation was unlike anything in her previous experience, not just physical attraction, though that was certainly present, but a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. It was as if she had been searching her entire life for something she couldn't name, and had suddenly discovered it in the most unexpected place imaginable. Every cell in her body seemed to vibrate with awareness of his presence, and she could feel her own spiritual energy responding to his in ways that created harmonics she had never experienced before. "Do you feel that?" she had whispered to her closest friend, Mira, who was serving alongside her in the ceremony as another acolyte in training for future religious responsibilities. "Feel what?" Mira had replied, looking around nervously for whatever supernatural threat might have alarmed the high priestess's daughter during such an important spiritual working. "The energy," Lyra had tried to explain, though she lacked words adequate to describe the profound spiritual connection that was developing between her and the young man from the Moonraven delegation. Something is happening. Something important. But there was no threat in the conventional sense, only recognition, the sudden understanding that she had found the other half of her soul in the most impossible place imaginable. Darius, despite his lower social status and his questionable spiritual connections, was everything that Lyra had unconsciously been seeking in a partner. Intelligent enough to match her quick mind, spiritually gifted in ways that complemented rather than competed with her own abilities, passionate about questions and possibilities that went beyond the mundane concerns of political advancement and social status. More importantly, he possessed a sense of humor that could make her laugh even during the most serious conversations, and a perspective on life that challenged her assumptions without threatening her fundamental sense of self. When he looked at her, she felt seen and understood in ways that no one else had ever achieved, as if he could perceive aspects of her nature that she herself was only beginning to discover. The fact that their connection was both immediate and mutual made it even more dangerous for both of them. Darius felt the same overwhelming attraction that Lyra experienced, the same sense of recognition and completion that suggested they had been unconsciously searching for each other their entire lives. But he also understood the social and political implications of their feelings far better than the sheltered daughter of the high priestess, having grown up in a world where the consequences of challenging established authority were always immediate and often severe. "This can't happen," he told her during their second conversation, which took place in the shadows behind the festival's main pavilion, where they wouldn't be observed by the many people who were constantly monitoring the behavior of high-ranking tribal members. "You know what you are, what your destiny is supposed to be according to your people's laws. And you know what I am, someone who can never be allowed to interfere with those carefully laid plans." "But what if the plans are wrong?" Lyra had challenged, her voice carrying the passionate intensity that would eventually lead to her downfall. "What if the ancestral spirits brought us together for a reason that transcends tribal law and social convention? What if there's something more important happening here than maintaining the status quo and preserving political arrangements that were made by people who lived centuries ago?" It was a dangerous question, one that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire civilization was built. The Silver Star social system was based on the belief that the ancestral spirits had established their laws and customs through divine revelation, and that deviating from these sacred patterns would bring cosmic punishment that could destroy their entire people. Suggesting that individual desires might override these spiritual imperatives was tantamount to questioning the authority of the gods themselves. But it was also a question that neither of them could ignore, especially as they continued to encounter each other throughout the week-long festival, and discovered that their spiritual compatibility was even more profound than their emotional connection. Working together on various magical projects and healing efforts, they found that their combined abilities could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone, creating synergies that suggested their partnership might be blessed by forces even greater than the tribal traditions that sought to prevent it. The collaborative healing work they performed during the festival produced results that were unprecedented in the recorded history of intertribal magical cooperation. Lyra's formal training in sophisticated Silver Star ritual techniques, combined with Darius's intuitive understanding of wild spiritual forces, created a synthesis that was both powerful and completely outside the normal categories of magical practice. When they joined their efforts to treat the mysterious illness affecting his tribe, the results were so dramatic that even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge that something extraordinary was occurring. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Elder Marcus, one of the Silver Star tribe's most conservative spiritual leaders, after witnessing their collaborative healing work during the festival's third day. The girl's abilities are amplified beyond anything we've seen before when she works with the Moonraven youth. It's as if they're accessing power sources that none of our traditional methods can reach. The observation was meant as a compliment to Lyra's exceptional natural gifts, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of her connection to Darius and the implications of their obviously powerful spiritual partnership. If their magical collaboration was so effective that it surpassed anything achievable through conventional methods, what did that suggest about the wisdom of preventing their continued association? Could the spirits themselves be indicating approval for a relationship that violated every established rule about appropriate social boundaries? Elder Marcus and the other conservative members of the Silver Star leadership were deeply troubled by these questions, recognizing that they challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divine will and human law. If the gods truly disapproved of cross-tribal romantic relationships, why would they bless such a partnership with unprecedented magical power? But if divine approval existed, what did that mean for all the other social rules and religious doctrines that governed their civilization? For Lyra, the answer was obvious and compelling. The spirits themselves had brought her and Darius together, and opposing their union was tantamount to defying divine will expressed through the most direct possible means. Their magical compatibility was proof that their love was blessed by forces greater than human authority, and anyone who sought to prevent their partnership was opposing the gods they claimed to serve. But for the tribal leadership, the situation was far more complex and threatening than simple romantic attraction between two young people from different social backgrounds. Allowing Lyra to marry outside her designated rank would set a precedent that could undermine the entire system of arranged marriages that maintained social stability and preserved the carefully cultivated bloodlines that produced their most powerful spiritual practitioners. If the High Priestess's own daughter could choose her husband based on personal preference rather than tribal law, what would prevent other young people from making similar demands? The marriage system that had preserved their civilization for 8 centuries depended on the principle that individual desires must be subordinated to collective needs, and any deviation from this rule could lead to widespread rebellion against the carefully constructed social order that protected their people from chaos and spiritual corruption. The crisis came to a head when Lyra formally requested permission to break her betrothal to Aldrich Stormcrown and instead marry Darius Shadowheart. The request was made during a private meeting with her mother, but word of it spread quickly through the tribal leadership, creating a scandal that threatened to overshadow all other political considerations and force a confrontation between competing principles of authority that had never been tested in such a direct manner. "You can't be serious," High Priestess Serena had said when her daughter first broached the subject during what was supposed to be a routine consultation about wedding preparations for her upcoming marriage to Aldrich. "Darius is a fine young man, and his abilities are certainly impressive in their unconventional way, but he's not of our rank. He can't provide you with the status, security, or spiritual authority that your position requires." "I don't want status or authority if they come at the cost of my soul," Lyra had replied with the naive idealism of someone who had never experienced powerlessness or understand the practical realities of political leadership. "I want love, partnership, and the chance to use my abilities in service of something greater than political convenience and bloodline preservation." "What you want is irrelevant to the responsibilities you inherited at birth," her mother had responded with the cold practicality that had made her an effective leader for more than 20 years, despite the enormous pressures and challenges involved in governing a magical civilization. "Your marriage isn't about your personal happiness. It's about the future of our tribe and the preservation of spiritual gifts that have protected our people for centuries. The children you bear will be the next generation of religious and political leaders, and their bloodline must be pure and powerful enough to handle those enormous responsibilities." The argument that followed was passionate and painful for both women, representing not just a conflict between individual desire and social duty, but a fundamental disagreement about the nature of divine will and the relationship between personal choice and cosmic order. Serena loved her daughter deeply and wanted her to be happy, but she also understood her responsibilities as High Priestess in ways that Lyra couldn't fully appreciate, despite her extensive education in tribal history and religious doctrine. The stability of their entire society depended on maintaining the traditional systems that had preserved their people through centuries of challenges and changes that would have destroyed less carefully organized civilizations. Their magical defenses, their economic prosperity, their political alliances, and their spiritual connection to the divine all depended on maintaining social structures that had been tested and refined over generations of experience. Allowing one young woman's romantic feelings to override those systems, no matter how sincere or spiritually powerful those feelings might be, could have consequences that extended far beyond any individual happiness. If the marriage laws could be changed based on personal preference, what would prevent similar challenges to other fundamental aspects of their social order? How long would it take for their carefully preserved civilization to collapse into the kind of chaos that had destroyed so many other attempts at creating stable human communities? "You're asking me to sacrifice my soul for the sake of tradition," Lyra had argued, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded for her mother's understanding and support in what she saw as the most important decision of her life. "I'm asking you to sacrifice your personal desires for the sake of your people," Serena had replied, her own voice heavy with the pain of having to deny her daughter's deepest wishes while fulfilling her duties as a leader responsible for the welfare of thousands of people. That's what leadership means, putting the greater good ahead of your own wants and needs, even when that choice breaks your heart. The philosophical debate continued for hours, with both women presenting arguments that were logically coherent and emotionally compelling from their different perspectives on the relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities. Serena spoke of duty, tradition, and the need to preserve institutions that had been tested by centuries of experience. Lyra spoke of love, spiritual calling, and the possibility that blind adherence to tradition might prevent their people from evolving to meet new challenges that required new solutions. But underlying their rational arguments was a deeper conflict about the nature of divine authority and the mechanisms through which cosmic will was expressed in human affairs. Serena believed that the gods spoke through established institutions and traditional practices that had been validated by long experience and careful theological study. Lyra believed that the spirits communicated directly through personal revelation and individual spiritual experiences that might contradict conventional wisdom. "How do you know that your feelings aren't just selfish desire dressed up as spiritual insight?" Serena had challenged during one of the most intense moments of their debate. "How do you know that your traditions aren't just human stubbornness dressed up as divine commandment?" Lyra had replied, her response revealing the fundamental epistemological divide that made their conflict impossible to resolve through rational discussion alone. But Lyra was young, passionate, and absolutely convinced that her love for Darius represented something sacred that transcended human law and custom. When the formal request for permission to break her betrothal was considered and rejected by the Council of Elders after extensive deliberation and consultation with religious authorities, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She chose to follow her heart regardless of the consequences, believing that spiritual truth was more important than social conformity. The secret relationship that developed between Lyra and Darius over the following months was conducted with all the intensity and desperation of lovers who knew their time together was limited and that discovery would bring catastrophic consequences for both of them. They met in hidden places throughout the mountain territories, sharing not just physical intimacy, but spiritual communion that deepened their connection and strengthened their magical abilities when they worked together on healing and mystical projects. Their favorite meeting place was a sacred grove that had been abandoned by the official priesthood centuries earlier, when changes in religious doctrine had made its particular spiritual associations unfashionable. The grove was located in a remote valley that required hours of difficult hiking to reach, making it unlikely that they would be discovered by casual travelers or official patrols. More importantly, The ancient trees and standing stones that marked the site still hummed with magical energy that amplified their combined abilities and created an environment where their spiritual partnership could flourish without interference. "We're not just lovers," Darius told her during one of their clandestine meetings in the grove, his voice filled with wonder as he described the visions and insights that came to him when they worked together on magical projects. "We're something new, something that the old ways never accounted for or prepared for. Maybe that's why the spirits brought us together, to show our people that there are other possibilities beyond the traditions they've always followed without question." Their relationship wasn't just romantic but transformative in ways that neither had anticipated when they first felt the powerful attraction that had drawn them together. When they made love, the very air around them would shimmer with otherworldly energy that was visible even to non-magical observers, and plants would bloom out of season in response to the power they generated through their physical and spiritual union. Their combined consciousness could reach into dimensions of reality that were normally accessible only to the most advanced spiritual practitioners, and they began to understand truths about the nature of existence that challenged everything they had been taught. The mystical experiences they shared during their secret meetings revealed that their connection operated on levels far deeper than simple romantic attraction or even spiritual compatibility. They were accessing cosmic forces that connected individual consciousness to universal principles, discovering aspects of divine reality that were normally hidden from human perception by the limitations of ordinary awareness and conventional religious practice. "I can see the patterns now," Lyra told him during one of their deep meditative trances in the sacred grove, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond normal human hearing. "The connections between all living things, the energy flows that shape reality, the purposes behind events that seem random and meaningless from normal perspective. We're being shown things that could change how our people understand the universe itself." The knowledge they gained through their mystical partnership was both exhilarating and terrifying, revealing possibilities for human consciousness and spiritual development that went far beyond anything described in their traditional religious teachings. They began to understand that the established doctrines of both their tribes represented only elementary steps in a much larger journey of spiritual evolution, and that their love was serving as a catalyst for advancement to higher levels of understanding and ability. But such profound spiritual experiences were impossible to hide completely, especially for someone in Lyra's prominent position within tribal society. Other people began to notice that her abilities had grown exponentially over the past few months, and that she sometimes spoke about spiritual concepts that were far beyond anything covered in the traditional educational curriculum for young priestesses. Her mother, in particular, became increasingly suspicious about the source of her daughter's newfound wisdom and power. The changes in Lyra were obvious to anyone with sensitivity to spiritual energy patterns. Her aura had become brighter and more complex, indicating access to power sources that should have been beyond her current level of training and experience. Her magical techniques had evolved to incorporate methods that weren't taught in conventional Silver Star practice, suggesting that she was receiving instruction from unauthorized sources. Most tellingly, her entire demeanor had acquired a confidence and depth that spoke of direct mystical experiences that went far beyond anything achievable through normal religious education. "There's something different about you," Serena observed during one of their regular training sessions in the temple, her experienced eye detecting the subtle but unmistakable signs that her daughter was developing in ways that hadn't been approved by the established curriculum. "Your energy has changed, become more complex and powerful than anything I've seen before in someone your age. What aren't you telling me about your spiritual practices and studies?" The direct question forced Lyra to confront the impossible choice between honesty and safety that had been growing more difficult to avoid as her secret relationship with Darius continued to deepen and transform both of them. She knew that revealing the truth about their partnership would bring catastrophic consequences for both of them. But she was also finding it increasingly difficult to lie to her mother about something so fundamental to her identity and spiritual development. "I've been exploring new forms of meditation and energy work," she said carefully, which was technically true, even though it omitted the most important details about the source and nature of her new abilities. I think I'm beginning to understand aspects of the spiritual realm that aren't covered in our traditional practices, and I'm discovering that there are many more possibilities for human consciousness than our conventional teachings suggest. The explanation satisfied Serena's immediate curiosity about her daughter's obvious advancement, but it also raised new concerns about the direction and supervision of Lyra's spiritual education and development. If she was advancing beyond traditional teachings on her own initiative, it suggested that she might be receiving instruction from unauthorized sources, a possibility that was deeply troubling for someone responsible for maintaining orthodox religious doctrine and preventing the infiltration of dangerous or heretical influences into their spiritual practices. The investigation that followed was discreet but thorough, with trusted members of the priesthood quietly observing Lyra's activities and trying to identify any irregular spiritual influences in her life. The High Priestess couldn't afford to ignore the possibility that her own daughter might be involved with practitioners of forbidden arts or unconventional magical traditions that could compromise the doctrinal purity of their religious establishment. It didn't take long for them to notice her periodic absences from the settlement, always explained by vague references to gathering herbs for her studies or conducting personal meditation retreats in natural settings that were supposed to enhance spiritual development. The explanations were plausible enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but the pattern of her disappearances was consistent enough to suggest that she was meeting someone or something on a regular schedule. "She's definitely going somewhere specific," reported Sister Elena, one of the junior priestesses who had been tasked with monitoring Lyra's movements, without appearing to spy on the High Priestess's daughter. "She leaves the settlement regularly, always alone, and always returns several hours later with a glow about her that suggests recent spiritual activity of unusual intensity. But she's not going to any of the official sacred sites that we know about, and she's not following any of the traditional ritual patterns we've taught her." The evidence was circumstantial but increasingly damning, suggesting that Lyra was indeed receiving unauthorized spiritual instruction from an unknown source that was producing results far beyond anything achievable through conventional methods. The possibility that she might be involved with a practitioner of forbidden arts or unconventional magical traditions was serious enough to warrant formal investigation by the Council of Elders, despite the political complications involved in investigating the High Priestess's own daughter. The investigation expanded to include inquiries among the other tribes that had participated in the recent harvest festival, seeking information about any individuals who might have had contact with Lyra and who possessed the kind of abilities necessary to produce the changes that had been observed in her spiritual development. The inquiries were conducted carefully to avoid creating diplomatic incidents, but they were thorough enough to eventually identify Darius Shadowheart as someone who had been present at the festival and who possessed exactly the kind of unconventional magical gifts that might explain Lyra's transformation. More damaging evidence came from Moonraven sources who reported that Darius had been absent from his own tribal territory on the same schedule as Lyra's mysterious disappearances, and that he too had been displaying signs of enhanced abilities and spiritual advancement that couldn't be explained through normal educational processes. The correlation was too significant to be coincidental, suggesting that the two young people had been meeting secretly and working together on magical projects that violated the laws and customs of both their tribes. The confrontation came on a cold autumn evening when Lyra returned from one of her secret meetings to find her mother waiting in her chambers, accompanied by Elder Marcus and two other senior members of the tribal hierarchy. The expressions on their faces made it immediately clear that her secret had been discovered, and that the consequences would be severe beyond anything she had previously imagined. "We know about Darius Shadowheart," her mother said without preamble, her voice carrying the cold authority of her official position, rather than the warmth of maternal concern that had characterized their previous private conversations. "We know about your relationship with him, about your secret meetings in forbidden places, and about the unauthorized spiritual practices you've been engaging in together." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, destroying in an instant the fragile illusion that she could continue living a double life indefinitely without facing the consequences of her choices. The secret that had sustained her for months was finally exposed, And with it came the realization that everything she had built with Darius was about to be destroyed by forces that neither of them possessed the power to resist. "How long have you known?" she asked, though the answer hardly mattered now that the truth was out, and she was facing the people who would determine her punishment for violating the most fundamental laws of their society. "Long enough to understand the full extent of your betrayal," Elder Marcus replied harshly, his voice carrying the moral outrage of someone whose entire worldview had been challenged by her actions. "You violated your betrothal vows, dishonored your family's reputation, and engaged in spiritual practices that are forbidden by tribal law and religious doctrine. Any one of these offenses would be serious enough to warrant severe punishment. Together, they constitute a complete repudiation of everything our society stands for." The formal trial that followed was a foregone conclusion, though it was conducted with all the ceremony and gravity appropriate to such a momentous decision affecting the highest levels of tribal leadership. Lyra was allowed to present her defense, to argue that her relationship with Darius was sanctioned by the spirits themselves, and that their combined abilities proved the wisdom of their union rather than the folly of their rebellion against established authority. She spoke passionately about love transcending social boundaries, about the need for spiritual evolution beyond the limitations of ancient traditions, and about the possibility that the old ways might not be adequate for the challenges their people would face in a changing world that required new solutions to unprecedented problems. Her arguments were eloquent and heartfelt, drawing on everything she had learned through her mystical experiences with Darius, and her growing understanding of cosmic principles that operated beyond the scope of conventional religious doctrine. But her words fell on deaf ears among judges who were not interested in spiritual innovation or romantic idealism. The Council of Elders was concerned with maintaining the social order that had preserved their people for centuries, and they viewed Lyra's personal happiness, however sincere and compelling it might be, as irrelevant compared to the greater good of tribal stability and the preservation of traditions that had been tested by generations of experience. "You have chosen individual desire over collective responsibility," pronounced Elder Sarah, the senior member of the council, as she delivered the verdict that everyone present had known was inevitable from the moment the trial began. "You have rejected the wisdom of your ancestors in favor of your own untested impulses and romantic fantasies. You have dishonored your family, violated your sacred obligations, and challenged the very foundations of our society." The charges were read with ceremonial formality that emphasized the magnitude of her crimes against tribal law and religious doctrine. She was accused of breaking her betrothal vows, which was considered a form of theft, since it deprived Aldrich Stormcrown of the alliance and bloodline benefits he had been promised. She was charged with engaging in unauthorized spiritual practices that violated established religious protocols and potentially exposed their people to dangerous supernatural influences. Most seriously, she was accused of rejecting her duties as heir to the high priestess, abandoning responsibilities that affected the spiritual welfare. The sentence was exile, complete and permanent banishment from the tribal territories, with the warning that any attempt to return would be met with deadly force from warriors who had been instructed to treat her as a dangerous enemy rather than a former member of their community. She would be stripped of her rank, her inheritance, and her spiritual authority, losing not just her material possessions but her very identity as a member of the Silver Star tribe. "You are no longer Lyra Moonwhisper," Elder Sarah continued with the finality of divine judgment that left no room for appeal or mercy. "You are no longer our daughter, our sister, or our fellow tribeswoman. You are an exile, cut off from the community that gave you birth and cast out to make your own way in a world that has no place for those who reject the wisdom of their people." The formal ceremony of banishment was scheduled for dawn the following day, allowing Lyra one final night to contemplate the magnitude of what she was losing and to say goodbye to the life she had known since childhood. She was confined to her chambers under guard, forbidden from speaking to anyone except the priestesses who brought her food, and prepared her for the ritual of exile that would permanently sever her connection to everything she had ever called home. The night passed in a haze of grief and disbelief as Lyra tried to process the reality of what was happening to her. Everything she had ever taken for granted, Her family, her status, her spiritual authority, her very identity, was being stripped away because she had dared to follow her heart instead of accepting the destiny that others had chosen for her. The injustice of it burned in her chest like a physical pain, but there was nothing she could do to change the decision that had been made by people who valued tradition more than individual happiness. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, Lyra heard the drums beginning to sound throughout the settlement, calling the entire tribe to witness her formal banishment. The rhythm was slow and mournful, like a funeral dirge for someone who had died, which in many ways accurately reflected what was about to happen to her. The person known as Lyra Moonwhisper would cease to exist at the end of the ceremony, replaced by a nameless exile with no connection to the community that had shaped her entire understanding of herself and her place in the world. The ceremony of banishment was conducted at the settlement's main gate, where the entire tribe had gathered to witness the formal severing of ties that had bound Lyra to her community since birth. She stood alone in the center of a ceremonial circle, while the council of elders recited the ancient words that would transform her from a beloved daughter into a dangerous outsider who could never be welcomed back. The ritual required her to surrender all symbols of her tribal membership: her ceremonial robes that marked her as heir to the high priestess position, her spiritual talismans that connected her to the ancestral spirits who protected their people, her family jewelry that proclaimed her bloodline and inheritance rights, and even the small carved pendant that had been given to her at birth to mark her as her mother's daughter and rightful successor. Each item was taken from her with formal solemnity and placed in a sacred fire that would purify them of her contamination, allowing them to be reassigned to someone who had remained loyal to tribal traditions. The symbolism was clear and devastating. Everything that had defined her identity was being burned away, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge of what she had lost through her stubborn refusal to accept the wisdom of her elders. By the power of the ancestral spirits and the authority of the tribal council, High Priestess Serena intoned in her official capacity, her voice breaking slightly, despite her efforts to maintain the cold dignity required by the ceremony. I declare you exiled from this place and these people. You are stripped of name, rank, and kinship. You are cast out to wander as a stranger in lands that will never welcome you as their own. The words of banishment were followed by the ritual of replacement, in which Serena formally adopted her niece Cassandra as her new daughter and heir, transferring to her all the rights and responsibilities that had once belonged to Lyra. The ceremony was necessary to maintain the continuity of spiritual authority that protected their people, but it was also a public demonstration that family bonds meant nothing compared to loyalty to tribal traditions. Watching her cousin take her place in the ceremonial hierarchy was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal for Lyra. Cassandra was a good person who had always treated her with genuine affection, but she was also someone who had never questioned the wisdom of their traditions or imagined that individual desires might sometimes conflict with collective needs. She would be a dutiful daughter to Serena and a reliable guardian of orthodox religious doctrine, exactly what their people needed in a spiritual leader. But she would never experience the kind of transcendent love that had transformed Lyra's understanding of what was possible in human relationships, and she would never access the profound spiritual insights that came from challenging conventional wisdom and seeking truth beyond the boundaries of established doctrine. In gaining a reliable heir, Serena was losing the possibility of spiritual evolution that might have elevated their entire civilization to new levels of understanding and ability. The final part of the banishment ceremony required Lyra to walk through the settlement's gates, while every member of the tribe turned their backs to her, symbolically refusing to acknowledge her existence or remember her as one of their own. The ritual rejection was absolute and permanent, ensuring that she could never return to claim sanctuary or assistance from people who had once loved her, but who were now forbidden to recognize her as anything more than a dangerous stranger. She was given rough traveling clothes to replace the fine garments that had marked her elevated status, along with a basic pack of supplies that would sustain her for perhaps a week if she was careful and lucky. No weapons were provided, as she was not considered worthy of the tools that marked a true member of their warrior culture. No money was offered, as she no longer had any claim to the family wealth that had supported her throughout her privileged childhood and adolescence. Most cruelly, no spiritual protections were granted for her journey into the dangerous wilderness areas that surrounded their mountain territories. The talismans and blessings that normally protected tribal members from supernatural threats were denied to her, leaving her vulnerable to forces that could destroy an unprepared traveler in ways far worse than simple death. The guards who escorted her to the borders of tribal territory were men who had known her since childhood, warriors who had once competed for the honor of serving as her protectors when she became high priestess. But they were forbidden to show any signs of personal affection or sympathy during their final duty regarding her, and their faces remained impassive as they watched her cross into exile and disappear into the forests that would now be her only home. The last thing she saw as she looked back from the edge of tribal territory was her mother standing on the walls of the settlement, tears streaming down her face as she watched her only child disappear into a wilderness that was known to be filled with dangers that could kill even experienced warriors. It was an image that would haunt both women for years to come, the final moment when duty triumphed over love and law overcame the bonds of family that should have been stronger than any human institution. But Lyra was not entirely alone in her exile, though the isolation would be more complete than she initially realized. Darius, who had also been investigated and banished from his own tribe when their relationship was discovered, was supposed to meet her at a predetermined location, several miles beyond the borders of both their territories. They had planned for this possibility during their secret meetings, establishing contingency arrangements that would allow them to find each other if their worst fears were realized, and they were both cast out by their respective peoples. The meeting place was a natural cave system that they had discovered during one of their explorations of the wilderness areas between tribal territories. The caves were deep enough to provide shelter from weather and predators, well hidden enough to avoid detection by hostile forces, and located near fresh water and other resources that would be necessary for survival in exile. More importantly, the caves were situated in a region that was considered neutral territory by all the local tribes, meaning that they could establish a temporary base there without immediately attracting the attention of authorities who might try to capture or kill them. Lyra reached the caves 3 days after her banishment, having traveled carefully through dangerous terrain while avoiding the established paths that might be monitored by patrols from either tribe. The journey was more difficult than anything she had ever attempted, requiring survival skills that she possessed only in theory from her education in traditional women's arts that included basic knowledge of wilderness travel and foraging. But when she finally arrived at their predetermined meeting place, Darius was not there. She waited for 2 weeks in the cold, damp caves, surviving on the meager supplies she had been given and the wild plants she could identify as safe to eat. Every day she expected to see him approaching through the forest, carrying his own pack of exile supplies and ready to begin building a new life together in the wilderness that would be their only home. Every night she fell asleep, listening for footsteps that never came, hoping that the next dawn would bring the reunion that would make their suffering worthwhile. The isolation was crushing in ways that she had never anticipated during their romantic planning for a possible life together outside tribal society. The reality of being completely alone in a hostile environment, without the social connections and support systems that had sustained her throughout her protected childhood, was far more devastating than the physical hardships of finding food and shelter in the wilderness. But worse than the loneliness was the growing realization that something terrible must have happened to prevent Darius from keeping their appointment. He was not the kind of person who would abandon her without explanation, especially not after everything they had risked and sacrificed for their love. If he was not at their meeting place, it meant that he was either dead or imprisoned in circumstances that made travel impossible. The truth was worse than either of those possibilities, though Lyra would not learn it until much later. Darius had been captured by Moonraven warriors on his way to meet her, not for the purpose of punishment, but for a fate that was considered far more appropriate for someone with his unusual spiritual gifts. Rather than exiling him and losing access to his abilities entirely, the Moonraven leadership had decided to keep him as a prisoner whose talents could be exploited for tribal benefit while his freedom and dignity were destroyed as punishment for his betrayal of their customs. He was being held in a hidden location where his spirit-touched abilities were being used to serve his captor's purposes. His knowledge of healing and mystical arts extracted through methods that left him alive, but broken in ways that made escape impossible. The Moonravens had concluded that his gifts were too valuable to waste through simple banishment, but his defiance of their authority required punishment that would serve as an example to others who might be tempted to follow their hearts instead of their duties. Lyra never learned these details, spending her years of exile believing that Darius had died during his escape from tribal territory or had chosen to abandon their planned reunion in favor of seeking safety elsewhere. The uncertainty was perhaps more torturous than knowledge of his fate would have been, leaving her to wonder whether their love had been strong enough to sustain him through the trials of exile, or whether he had decided that their relationship was not worth the sacrifices it required. After 2 weeks of waiting in vain for his arrival, Lyra was forced to accept that she would be surviving alone in the wilderness that stretched beyond the borders of civilized territory. The supplies she had been given were nearly exhausted, and the approaching winter would make survival far more difficult unless she could find or create better shelter and food sources than the caves and wild plants that had sustained her during her period of waiting. The months that followed were the most difficult of her life, requiring her to learn skills and develop strength that she had never needed during her protected existence as the High Priestess's daughter and heir. She had to master the arts of hunting, trapping, and foraging that would keep her alive through the harsh mountain winter. She had to create tools and weapons from materials she could find in the wilderness, having been denied the manufactured goods that made survival possible for members of civilized society. Most challenging of all, she had to learn to live with the constant awareness that she was completely alone in a world that offered no safety, no comfort, and no certainty that she would survive from one day to the next. The psychological pressure of such isolation was more devastating than the physical hardships of finding food and shelter, forcing her to develop inner resources of strength and determination that she had never known she possessed. But the experience also liberated her from the constraints and limitations that had defined her existence within tribal society. Free from the expectations and judgments that had shaped every aspect of her previous life, she was able to explore the full potential of her spiritual gifts, without the restrictions imposed by orthodox doctrine and traditional practice. The mystical abilities that had been developing during her relationship with Darius continued to grow and evolve during her years of exile, enhanced by the direct connection to natural forces that came from living in intimate contact with the wilderness. Without the interference of civilization's artificial boundaries and social constructions, she found that her consciousness could expand to encompass awareness of the living systems that sustained all existence. She learned to communicate directly with the spirits of the land, the entities that governed weather and growth, and the cycles of life and death that connected all beings in an intricate web of mutual dependence and support. The isolation that had initially seemed like punishment gradually became a form of spiritual education that was far more profound than anything available through conventional religious training. She was receiving direct instruction from sources that existed beyond human authority, learning truths about the nature of reality that challenged every assumption she had been taught about the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic principles. Her abilities continued to develop throughout her first year of exile, growing stronger and more sophisticated as she learned to work with spiritual forces without the mediation of human institutions or traditional practices. She could heal injuries and illnesses through direct energy manipulation, influence weather patterns through focused intention, and communicate with animals and plants in ways that transcended the normal boundaries between species and consciousness types. But perhaps most remarkably, she began to understand that her exile was not punishment, but preparation for something far greater than anything she could have achieved within the limitations of tribal society. The spiritual evolution that was occurring during her isolation was transforming her into something that transcended normal human categories, a being whose consciousness operated on levels that bridged the gap between mortal and divine existence. It was during her second year of exile that she discovered she was pregnant. The realization came to her gradually, as her body began to change in ways that reflected not just the normal process of pregnancy, but something far more extraordinary and unprecedented. The child growing within her was touched by the same spiritual forces that had transformed her during her years of exile, marked by energies that seemed to draw from sources beyond anything encountered in normal human experience. But the most mysterious aspect of her pregnancy was that it had occurred despite her complete isolation from human contact for more than a year. She had been entirely alone in the wilderness, with no possibility of normal conception through physical relationship with another person. Yet the life growing within her was undeniably real and developing according to patterns that suggested divine intervention in the normal processes of human reproduction. The pregnancy progressed unlike anything described in the traditional knowledge about childbirth and spiritual development that formed part of every woman's education in tribal society. Lyra found that her spiritual abilities continued to expand throughout the gestation period, as if the child she carried was somehow enhancing her connection to cosmic forces and opening new channels of mystical perception that had previously been inaccessible to human consciousness. More remarkably, the spiritual energy generated by her pregnancy began to affect the natural world around her in ways that suggested the unborn child was already influencing reality through its mere existence. Plants grew faster and stronger in areas where she spent time, producing fruits and healing herbs out of season in response to her presence. Animals approached without fear and seemed to receive some form of blessing from contact with her aura. Even the weather patterns shifted to provide more favorable conditions for her survival and comfort during the difficult months of pregnancy in the wilderness. "This child is blessed by forces I can't even name," she whispered to herself during one of her deep meditations in the grove that had become her primary sanctuary during the pregnancy. Whatever destiny awaits this little one, it's connected to powers that operate far beyond the understanding of any human society. The pregnancy also brought visions and revelations that helped her understand the true purpose behind her exile and the spiritual journey that had led her to this unprecedented situation. She began to see that her banishment from tribal society had been necessary to free her from the limitations that would have prevented her full spiritual development, and that her love affair with Darius had been orchestrated by cosmic forces that needed to prepare her for a role that no human institution could have envisioned or supported. The child she was carrying represented something entirely new in the relationship between human and divine consciousness, a being whose existence would bridge different levels of reality and open new possibilities for the evolution of sentient life. Her pregnancy was not just a personal experience, but a cosmic event that would have implications far beyond anything affecting individual happiness or tribal politics. During the final months of her pregnancy, Lyra received increasingly clear communications from spiritual entities that seemed to be preparing her for the extraordinary birth that was approaching. These beings, whose nature transcended any categories available in human language or understanding, provided her with knowledge about the child's purpose and the responsibilities that would come with raising someone whose consciousness operated on levels that bridged the mortal and divine realms. "The child will be a teacher for humanity," they told her, through direct mystical transmission that bypassed normal sensory channels. "But his education must come from sources beyond human culture and tradition. You have been chosen as his first teacher, but your role will be temporary. When the time is right, you will be called to serve a greater purpose that requires your consciousness to transcend the limitations of physical existence." The labor began during the spring equinox of her third year in exile, at the moment when the forces of growth and renewal were at their strongest throughout the natural world. The birth took place in the sacred grove where she had spent most of her pregnancy, surrounded by ancient trees whose spirits seemed to serve as midwives for an event that was both intensely personal and cosmically significant. The child emerged into the world surrounded by an aura of golden light that was visible even to normal human perception, and his first sounds were not the typical cries of a newborn, but musical tones that harmonized with the natural frequencies of the earth itself. His eyes opened immediately and focused on his mother with an awareness and intelligence that should have been impossible in someone who had just completed the transition from womb to world. "You're beautiful," Lyra whispered, as she held her son for the first time, marveling at the perfect features and the unusually serene expression that suggested he was completely comfortable with his existence despite the extraordinary circumstances of his birth. "And you're going to change everything, aren't you?" The baby's response was to reach toward her with tiny hands that seemed to glow with their own inner light, establishing a connection that went far beyond normal parent-child bonding and entered the realm of spiritual communion between beings whose consciousness operated on multiple levels simultaneously. As the days and weeks passed after the birth, it became increasingly clear that this child was unlike anything in recorded human experience. He developed at an accelerated rate that suggested supernatural influence, reaching physical and mental milestones far ahead of the normal schedule for human infants. But more remarkable than his rapid development was the profound spiritual presence that surrounded him, an aura of peace and wisdom that affected everyone and everything in his vicinity. Animals throughout the region seemed to recognize him as something special, making pilgrimages to the grove where he lived with his mother, and offering their reverence to someone they instinctively understood was connected to the fundamental forces that governed all life. Plants flourished in his presence, producing unusual blooms and fruits that seemed to carry healing properties beyond anything found in normal botanical specimens. But perhaps most significantly, Lyra found that her own spiritual development continued to accelerate as she cared for this extraordinary child. The act of nurturing someone whose consciousness operated on cosmic levels was transforming her understanding of reality and opening channels of perception that allowed her to access knowledge normally reserved for the highest spiritual masters. "He's teaching me things I never imagined," she told herself during one of their shared meditation sessions, when the baby's presence seemed to enhance her ability to perceive the underlying patterns that connected all existence. "Through caring for him, I'm learning about aspects of divine love and cosmic purpose that no human educational system could have revealed." The months of caring for her supernatural child in the isolation of the wilderness became a period of spiritual education that prepared Lyra for the transformation that was approaching. She gradually understood that her role as his mother was temporary, that she was being prepared to make a sacrifice that would serve purposes far greater than personal happiness or maternal attachment. The spiritual entities that had guided her throughout her pregnancy continued to provide instruction about the child's purpose and the cosmic plan that required her eventual separation from the son she loved more than life itself. They explained that the boy needed to be raised within human society if he was to fulfill his destiny as a bridge between mortal and divine consciousness, but that his education required teachers who could provide stability and community resources that she could never offer in exile. The child must learn to understand human nature from the inside, they explained, through mystical communication that transcended normal language. He must experience love, loss, community, and responsibility in ways that will prepare him to guide humanity toward its next phase of evolution. You have given him the foundation of spiritual awareness, but others must provide the social understanding that will make his cosmic knowledge accessible to ordinary human consciousness. The decision they required her to make was the most difficult choice imaginable: to give up the child who had become the center of her existence and to accept a destiny that would take her beyond the realm of physical existence entirely. But she also understood that her love for him demanded that she put his needs and purposes ahead of her own desires, no matter how devastating the sacrifice might be for her personal happiness. As the baby's first birthday approached, Lyra began to prepare for the separation that would change both their destinies forever. She performed blessing ceremonies that would protect him throughout his life, implanted in his developing consciousness the foundational knowledge he would need to understand his heritage and purpose, and created spiritual bonds that would connect them across any distance or dimensional barrier. "You will always be my son," she told him during their final nights together in the sacred grove, "and I will always be your mother, even when we exist in different realms of reality. The love between us transcends physical presence and will endure through whatever transformations await both of us." The journey back to Silver Star territory required careful planning and timing to avoid detection while traveling with an infant through dangerous wilderness areas. But Lyra also needed the time to prepare herself emotionally for the reunion that would be both triumphant and heartbreaking, marking the end of her exile, but also the beginning of her final separation from everything she held dear. During their travels, she shared with her son all the stories and wisdom she could offer about his heritage and the purposes he would serve when he came of age. She taught him about the love that had brought him into existence, about the spiritual forces that had shaped his development, and about the responsibilities that came with possessing abilities that transcended normal human limitations. "Remember that you are loved," she whispered to him as they approached the boundaries of her former homeland. "Not just by me, but by the cosmic forces that orchestrated your birth, and by the people who will benefit from your presence in their lives. Remember that your gifts are meant to serve others, not to elevate yourself above them. And remember that the greatest power comes from compassion and understanding, rather than from force or dominance." The return to Silver Star territory after 4 years of exile was both miraculous and terrifying for everyone involved. Lyra approached the settlement at dawn, carrying her infant son and radiating a spiritual presence that was immediately recognizable to anyone with sensitivity to such phenomena. But she was also clearly transformed by her experiences in ways that challenged every assumption about the consequences of defying tribal authority and the relationship between punishment and divine favor. The guards who first spotted her approaching were struck speechless by her appearance and the obvious power that surrounded her like a visible aura of light and energy. She looked like the same person who had been banished 4 years earlier, but she also clearly possessed abilities and awareness that elevated her far beyond normal human categories. The baby she carried was equally extraordinary, radiating a spiritual presence that was both comforting and overwhelming in its intensity and purity. Word of her return spread through the settlement with unprecedented speed, bringing people running from every level and district to witness what seemed impossible. The return of someone who had been declared dead to their community and whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about divine justice and the consequences of violating tribal law. High Priestess Serena was among the first to reach the settlement's gates, her face displaying a mixture of joy, disbelief, and terror, as she saw her daughter standing there with a baby whose spiritual significance was immediately apparent to her trained perception. 4 years of grief and regret had aged her considerably, and the sight of Lyra, alive, powerful, and somehow transformed beyond normal human limitations, threatened to overwhelm her emotional control entirely. "You came back," Serena whispered, reaching out tentatively, as if afraid that touching her daughter might prove that the vision was merely a cruel hallucination born of too many nights spent praying for impossible miracles. "I came back to give you something precious," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with spiritual frequencies beyond normal hearing. "Something that belongs to this place and these people, even though it came from beyond the boundaries of your traditional understanding." The baby she placed in her mother's arms was unlike any infant that the High Priestess had ever encountered in decades of presiding over births and blessing ceremonies. His spiritual presence was so powerful that she could feel it through direct contact, like holding a piece of crystallized starlight that pulsed with its own inner rhythm. His eyes held depths of awareness that suggested consciousness far beyond normal human capacity, and his peaceful expression indicated a serenity that should have been impossible in someone so young. "This child is no ordinary infant," Serena breathed as she felt the waves of spiritual energy emanating from the baby's small form. "He carries power that rivals anything in our most sacred traditions. Where did he come from? Who is his father?" The questions that had been building in the minds of everyone present were finally voiced by Elder Marcus as he pushed through the growing crowd of onlookers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate answers to questions of vital tribal importance. Lyra's response was to look up at the sky, her expression serene and knowing as she gazed toward realms of existence that were invisible to everyone else present. The gesture spoke more clearly than any words could have about the nature of her child's conception and the forces that had brought him into being through means that transcended normal human understanding. "His father is love itself," she said finally, her words creating ripples of spiritual energy that everyone present could feel, even if they couldn't fully understand their significance. His mother is the union of earth and heaven. His true nature is the bridge between what has been and what will be. The cryptic answer raised more questions than it resolved, but it also made clear that demanding conventional explanations would be futile. This child was the product of spiritual forces that operated according to laws beyond normal human comprehension, and understanding his true nature would require expanding their concepts of what was possible rather than trying to fit him into existing categories. As word of Lyra's return spread throughout the settlement, people began gathering to witness what many were already calling a miracle. The woman who had been exiled for defying tribal law had returned transformed into something approaching a spiritual master, bringing with her a child whose very existence challenged their understanding of the relationship between physical and spiritual reality. "What do you intend to do now?" Elder Marcus asked, his voice uncertain as he struggled to process the implications of her return. "You were banished from this place. By law, you should be executed for coming back." "I don't intend to stay," Lyra replied simply. "I came only to return what belongs here. This child who will grow up among his people and serve purposes that you will come to understand in time." The revelation that she planned to leave again sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If she wasn't seeking readmission to tribal society, what was the purpose of her return? And how could she bear to abandon the extraordinary child she had brought back with her? High Priestess Serena, still holding the baby and feeling the profound spiritual energy that emanated from his small form, understood immediately what her daughter was proposing. "You want us to raise him," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of such an enormous responsibility. "He needs what I can never give him," Lyra explained, her eyes never leaving her son's peaceful face. "He needs community, stability, teachers who can help him understand human nature from the inside. I've given him the foundation of spiritual knowledge, but you must provide the social understanding that will make his gifts accessible to ordinary people." The discussion that followed was unlike anything in the tribe's recorded history. Here was a woman who had been declared dead to their society, offering them a gift that could transform their understanding of divine power and human potential. But accepting the child would mean acknowledging that her exile had led to something miraculous, rather than the destruction they had predicted. Elder Sarah, who had pronounced Lyra's original sentence, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Even if we were willing to accept this child," she said carefully, "what guarantee do we have that he won't bring chaos or corruption to our people? His origins are mysterious, his nature unprecedented." "Look at him," Lyra said simply, gesturing toward the baby who was regarding the assembled crowd with serene awareness that should have been impossible in an infant. "Does he seem like a source of chaos to you? Or does he radiate the kind of peace and wisdom that our people have sought for centuries?" As if responding to her words, the baby began to glow with soft golden light that was visible even in the bright morning sun. The illumination was gentle and warming, creating a sense of profound calm that spread through the entire gathering. People who had been tense and suspicious moments before found themselves relaxing, their fears replaced by an inexplicable sense of hope and possibility. "He's blessing us," whispered someone in the crowd, voicing what everyone present could feel but struggled to articulate. The demonstration of the child's benevolent power made the decision easier for the tribal leadership. Whatever questions remained about his origins, his nature was clearly aligned with forces of healing and enlightenment, rather than destruction or corruption. "We will accept guardianship of this child," High Priestess Serena announced formally, speaking with the authority of her position as spiritual leader of their people. "He will be raised as one of our own, educated in our traditions, and protected according to our laws." But even as she spoke the words of acceptance, Serena could see that her daughter was preparing for another departure, this one more final than the exile that had separated them 4 years earlier. "Where will you go?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be beyond her ability to understand or accept. Lyra's response was to begin glowing with the same golden light that surrounded her son, her physical form becoming increasingly translucent as spiritual transformation accelerated beyond the point where material existence could be maintained. "I go where love calls me," she said, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to come from realms beyond normal perception. "My time in physical form is ending, but my purpose is just beginning. This child will need guidance from sources beyond human knowledge as he grows, and I will provide that guidance from whatever realm I'm called to serve." The assembled crowd watched in amazement and grief as Lyra began her final transformation, her body dissolving into pure light, while her consciousness expanded to encompass dimensions of reality that transcended individual existence. But before her physical form disappeared entirely, she spoke final words that would guide her son's upbringing and shape the future of their entire civilization. "Raise him with love, but do not shelter him from responsibility," she said, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Teach him wisdom, but allow him to question tradition when questioning serves truth. Help him understand his power, but ensure he never forgets that strength exists to protect the weak, not to dominate them." The light intensified until it was almost too bright to look at directly, then gradually faded as Lyra completed her transition to whatever destiny awaited her beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. She was gone, leaving behind only the memory of her presence and the extraordinary child who would carry forward her legacy in ways that no one could yet predict. The baby, now orphaned, but somehow completely serene about his circumstances, continued to radiate the peaceful energy that had marked his nature from birth. High Priestess Serena found herself serving as his primary caregiver, a role that brought both joy and tremendous responsibility as she attempted to nurture someone whose abilities and awareness far exceeded anything in her previous experience. The child was given the name Aurelius, meaning Golden One, in recognition of the light that had surrounded both him and his mother during her final transformation. But caring for him proved to be unlike raising any normal infant, as his development proceeded at an accelerated pace that suggested supernatural influence on every aspect of his growth. By his first birthday, Aurelius was walking with unusual grace and speaking in complete sentences that demonstrated vocabulary and understanding far beyond his apparent age. His spiritual abilities manifested early and powerfully, allowing him to heal minor injuries with a touch, communicate with animals through some form of telepathic connection, and perceive energy patterns that were invisible to normal human senses. "He learns things we never teach him," Serena reported to the Council of Elders during one of their regular meetings about the remarkable child's progress. "Yesterday, I found him creating geometric patterns in the dirt that correspond to advanced mathematical principles I've never seen before. When I asked where he learned them, he said the patterns spoke to him directly." The boy's education became a collaborative effort involving every scholar and spiritual teacher in the tribe, as no single person possessed sufficient knowledge to guide someone whose understanding seemed to draw from sources beyond human experience. Traditional lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic were supplemented by advanced instruction in philosophy, spiritual practice, and the complex social dynamics that governed their civilization. But perhaps most importantly, Aurelius was taught about compassion and service to others, values that would prove crucial as his powers continued to develop and expand. His caretakers understood that someone with his abilities could easily become corrupted by the temptation to use power for personal advantage, and they worked constantly to ensure that his moral development kept pace with his supernatural gifts. "Power without wisdom is dangerous," Elder Marcus told him during one of their regular philosophical discussions. "But power without compassion is evil. Your abilities are gifts meant to serve others, not tools for your own advancement." Aurelius absorbed these lessons with the serious attention of someone who understood their importance despite his youth. But he also demonstrated an intuitive understanding of ethical principles that suggested his moral compass had been influenced by the same divine forces that had shaped his supernatural abilities. As he grew older, Aurelius began to display leadership qualities that attracted followers from among both children and adults in the settlement. His peaceful nature and obvious spiritual gifts made him a natural mediator in disputes, and his wisdom often exceeded that of people many times his age. By his 10th birthday, he was already being consulted by the Council of Elders on matters affecting the welfare of their entire tribe. "He has insights that none of us possess," Elder Sarah admitted during one council session, where Aurelius had provided guidance that resolved a complex trade dispute with neighboring tribes. "It's as if he can see connections and possibilities that escape our more limited perception." But the boy's greatest gift was his ability to inspire others to become better versions of themselves. People who spent time with him found themselves questioning their own assumptions and striving to live according to higher principles than simple self-interest. His presence seemed to awaken dormant potentials for compassion and wisdom that elevated the entire spiritual atmosphere of their community. The transformation of tribal culture that occurred during Aurelius's childhood was gradual but profound. Practices that had been maintained through tradition rather than understanding were examined and modified to better serve their true purposes. Social hierarchies based on birth rather than merit were gradually replaced by systems that recognized individual worth and contribution. Most significantly, the rigid marriage laws that had led to his mother's exile were reformed to allow greater individual choice while still maintaining the spiritual considerations that protected their community. Lyra's sacrifice was not in vain, High Priestess Serena observed as she watched her grandson, for she had formally adopted him as such, lead a group of children in meditation exercises that would have challenged experienced adults. "Through her son, she has given us gifts that will transform our understanding of what human society can become." The boy's influence extended beyond their own tribe, as word of his remarkable abilities and wisdom spread throughout the region. Delegations from other communities began visiting the Silver Star territory specifically to meet him and seek his guidance on problems that had proven insoluble through conventional means. His reputation as a peacemaker and spiritual teacher grew with each successful mediation and each demonstration of wisdom that transcended normal human limitations. By his 15th birthday, Aurelius had become the de facto spiritual leader of their people despite his youth, with the formal priesthood serving more as administrators of his insights than as independent authorities. But he wore his authority lightly, always emphasizing service over dominance and consultation over command. "I am not your ruler," he would tell those who sought to elevate him to positions of formal power. "I am your servant, here to help you discover the wisdom and compassion that already exist within your own hearts." His approach to leadership was revolutionary in its humility and effectiveness. Rather than imposing solutions from above, he helped communities discover their own capacity for wisdom and cooperation. Rather than claiming special privilege due to his abilities, he used his gifts to empower others and enhance their own potential for spiritual development. The greatest test of his leadership came during his 18th year, when a confederation of hostile tribes threatened to invade Silver Star territory in an attempt to seize their mineral resources and strategic mountain positions. Traditional responses would have involved military preparation and alliance building to resist the invasion through force, but Aurelius proposed a different approach that challenged every assumption about conflict resolution and tribal warfare. "Violence creates more problems than it solves," he told the war council that had been convened to plan their defense. "Instead of preparing to fight them, we should seek to understand what they truly need and find ways to address those needs that benefit everyone involved." His suggestion was met with skepticism and concern from the military leadership, who pointed out that the hostile confederation had already rejected diplomatic overtures and seemed committed to taking what they wanted through conquest rather than negotiation. But Aurelius possessed information about their enemies' true motivations that no conventional intelligence gathering could have provided. Through mystical means that transcended normal communication, he had perceived that the Confederation's aggression was driven by desperation rather than simple greed. Their own territories were failing due to environmental problems that threatened their survival. "They're not evil," he explained to the skeptical council members. "They're afraid. Their crops are failing, their water sources are drying up, and they see conquest as their only hope for saving their people. If we can address their underlying problems, we can transform enemies into allies." The solution he proposed was unprecedented in regional history. Instead of fighting the invasion, the Silver Stars would share their advanced agricultural and water management techniques with the Confederated tribes, helping them restore the productivity of their own lands in exchange for permanent peace agreements and future cooperation. The plan required tremendous courage and faith from the Silver Star leadership, as it meant making themselves vulnerable to people who had been planning to attack them. But Aurelius's moral authority and demonstrated wisdom convinced them to attempt his approach despite their fears and doubts. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. When the Confederation arrived at Silver Star borders expecting to fight for survival, they instead found offers of assistance that addressed their real needs more effectively than conquest ever could have. The transformation from enemies to allies occurred almost overnight, as desperate aggression gave way to grateful cooperation. "You have saved not just our tribes, but our children's future," the Confederation's war chief told Aurelius during the ceremony that formalized their new alliance. "We came here planning to take by force what we thought we needed, but you have given us something far more valuable, the knowledge and partnership that will allow us to thrive in our own lands." The success of this diplomatic revolution established Aurelius's reputation throughout the region as a leader whose wisdom could transcend the limitations that had constrained human societies for centuries. Communities that had been locked in ancient feuds began seeking his mediation, and his approaches to conflict resolution became models that were adopted across the known world. But perhaps his greatest achievement was the personal example he provided of how power could be exercised with humility and compassion. Despite possessing abilities that could have made him a tyrant or emperor, he remained committed to serving others and empowering them to discover their own potential for wisdom and cooperation. As Aurelius entered his 20s and began to establish his own family and community, the legacy of his mother's sacrifice became increasingly clear. Lyra's choice to follow her heart, despite social pressure, had led not to destruction, but to the birth of someone who would transform their understanding of human possibility and social organization. The child who had been born from forbidden love and raised by a community that had learned to value wisdom over tradition became a bridge between what humanity had been and what it could become. Through his leadership, the rigid hierarchies and inflexible customs that had once defined their civilization gave way to more fluid and responsive systems that honored both individual dignity and collective welfare. Lyra's exile led to our redemption, High Priestess Serena reflected in her final years, as she watched her adopted grandson continue to guide their people toward ever greater understanding and cooperation. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for love ultimately gave us the gift of learning how to love more wisely ourselves. The sacred grove, where Lyra had given birth to her extraordinary son, became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand the relationship between personal sacrifice and cosmic purpose. Visitors would meditate among the ancient trees, contemplating the story of a young woman who had chosen love over law, and whose choice had ultimately blessed countless lives. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light filtered through the forest in particularly beautiful ways, pilgrims reported sensing a presence among the trees, a figure of golden light who watched over the grove with eternal love, ensuring that the lessons learned through sacrifice and transformation would never be forgotten. Aurelius himself would sometimes visit the grove where his extraordinary life had begun, paying tribute to the mother whose courage had made his existence possible and whose love continued to guide him from whatever realm she now inhabited. He understood that he was living proof that individual choices, however costly they might seem at the time, could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond anything the chooser could have imagined. The story of his birth and upbringing became part of tribal legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that love, wisdom, and sacrifice could transform the world when they were aligned with cosmic purpose. Children grew up learning about the woman who had been banished for following her heart and who had returned with a gift that transformed their entire civilization. But the most powerful aspect of Aurelius's legacy was not his supernatural abilities or his political achievements, but the example he provided of how to live with integrity and compassion regardless of one's circumstances or capabilities. He showed that true leadership came not from commanding others, but from inspiring them to discover their own capacity for wisdom and goodness. In his later years, as Aurelius prepared to pass on his responsibilities to the next generation, he often spoke about the lessons he had learned from his unique upbringing and the cosmic forces that had shaped his destiny. "My mother gave me life twice," he would tell those who sought to understand his philosophy and approach to leadership. "Once when she brought me into physical existence, and again when she chose to sacrifice her own happiness for my greater good. Her example taught me that love is not possession, but liberation, that strength is not domination, but service, and that the greatest gifts we can offer are those that empower others to become more than they thought possible." The wisdom he shared continued to influence human civilization long after his own physical existence ended, inspiring countless individuals to choose courage over comfort, service over selfishness, and love over fear. His teachings spread throughout the known world, carrying with them the memory of a forbidden romance that had somehow produced the most profound spiritual leader in recorded history. And in the sacred grove where it all began, the presence that had once been Lyra Moonwhisper continued to watch over the world. Her sacrifice had helped to transform, her love transcending the boundaries of life and death to ensure that the lessons learned through exile and return would never be lost to human memory.